Um, Thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Deb. I'm the Outreach and Family Engagement Administrator for Chicago Hopes for Kids. And on the call, we've got Sarah Kelly, who's our AmeriCorps Programs Coordinator. She's going to be handling the chat and all things Zoom related. So thank you to Sarah Kelly from AmeriCorps at Chicago Hopes. And we've also got Sarah Swiston from Wings Chicago. She's going to be sharing some knowledge with us after our presentation on just the work that Wings does to support domestic violence victims and survivors, how you can get involved, and all things along those lines. If you have any questions that come up for you during this time, I encourage you to use the chat. Drop any questions in the chat, any reflections, feedback that you have. We'll be definitely checking the chat frequently throughout the presentation. So I want to encourage that channel of communication to be used. This is what we've got planned for our 1 hour of session today. We're going to go through a quick overview on Chicago Hopes for Kids, the work that we do. We'll jump into domestic violence and try to kind of break down by definition what is domestic violence. We'll try to debunk some myths that people have surrounding domestic violence, abuse victims, and then try to address what are some of the factors that contribute to homelessness when it relates to domestic violence. And then lastly, we'll hear from Sarah from Wings to just share some general knowledge with us on the work that they do and how we can get involved. All right. So if you're new to HOPES, welcome. HOPES actually stands for Heightening Opportunity and Potential for Educational Success. And it is definitely a mouthful. So we like to reference ourselves with the acronym of HOPE. And I've been with Hope for now going on 2 years this September. And I can honestly say that the work that we do does provide hope to families and youth that are experiencing homelessness in shelters throughout the city. Our mission is generally to support children living in shelters with educational resources and support. We empower them to succeed academically by fostering a hope and a love of learning. That is a very broad mission. So how do we do that, right? How are we able to make this impact that we do? We do that through after school support. We have on-site after school programming that happens right now at 10 shelters throughout the city and 2 community-based programs at the library and at community centers where you can essentially drop in to participate in our after school programming. Our program is centered around social emotional development and literacy support. We're able to combine these two things to work with youth that are exposed to many traumatic experiences, support them academically, and increase their literacy competencies. The next sector that we kind of focus on is just family engagement. And you'll see in this picture here, we had a family night at one of our shelters in their community in the kitchen space, which is another organization. I highly encourage you all to check it out. It's called Communities in the Kitchen, and they have high-end kitchens throughout the city of Chicago that you can rent out to facilitate some workshops like this. At this particular family night, we had a pizza events where students and families were able to come into the kitchen, make their own pizza, talk about the different toppings, talk about what they like to put on their pizza, and essentially just enjoy a good time all around. So that's just like a recap of our family engagement programming that we do. We also address the summer learning gap by providing a lot of our after school programming at the same shelters throughout the summer. And that program is essentially still focused on literacy, social emotional development, and of course fun, because summer is all about having fun, going outside. So we try to build in a lot of summer activities in our summer program, field trips, STEM-based learning, art enrichment opportunities. So a lot of cool, fun things happening throughout the summer for us at Hopes. And then Lastly, we are able to advance our mission of not only empowering children to succeed academically, but supporting their parents, right? Because parents are a child's number one first advocate. So we are able to partner with our shelters to provide parent programming that is centered on healing, hope, advocacy, making sure that parents are aware of their educational rights while they're experiencing homelessness, ensuring that parents have a support system in order to help them through this difficult time. So it's very much a holistic centered approach in our parent program. So you'll see here that these are the different ways that we are able to support youth and families living in shelters throughout the city. Our organization wasn't always this grand of a powerhouse that it is now. It actually started back in 2006. Our founder, Pat Rivera, was providing after school programming to students experiencing homelessness during her time as a social worker with CPS. After the funding for the program got cut, she did decide to extend these services to students in the shelter environment by meeting them exactly where they are. And then we gained nonprofit status in 2010. And since then, we've been able to expand to many shelters throughout the city. We recently celebrated our 10-year anniversary in 2020, and we're just thrilled to be able to continue doing this mission-based work and being of service to youth and families throughout the city. Just looking in the chat, I see the name for the organization that hosts the cooking events in the kitchen. So that the organization itself is called Communities in the Kitchen. I'm not sure if they themselves host classes or events, but they have the actual spaces that you're able to rent out for free in order to host your own events and things like that. So I'll just drop it in the chat. They're called Communities in the Kitchen. And this one in particular was in Inglewood. All right. So we're going to jump into domestic violence and just a very general overview on what is domestic violence, right? So by definition, domestic abuse is a pattern of coercive, controlling behavior that is a life-threatening crime. It affects people of all communities, all regardless of gender, age, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, immigration status. So you'll see it doesn't discriminate against anyone. Although many of the victims of domestic violence are women, that doesn't mean that men are not prone to domestic violence in their relationships either. So listed on this slide, you'll see that there's some examples of the different types of abuse that victims may be subjected to. I would also like to point out that psychological abuse can also be very present in the form of either stalking or embarrassing a victim in public. These are also considered forms of domestic violence. And again, domestic violence is considered a crime against others. So let's take a look at some of the ways that domestic violence can manifest itself into relationships. And the first one being emotional abuse. This can look like name calling, intimidating, humiliating your significant other, yelling in their face in menacing ways, manipulating children to believe that maybe the violence is normal, maybe that the person asked for the violence. So really hindering that relationship of power between parents and children, and telling the other person where they can or cannot go. The next form that you see here is physical abuse. So that can come in the form of, let's just try. Okay. Give me an okay in the chat if you can still hear me this way.
We can still hear you, Deb. Thanks. All right, so getting back on track here, physical abuse can look like shoving, pushing, slapping, punching, hurting, or threatening to hurt their children or even the pets that are in the home. And we will kind of dissect some of this a little bit as we go through the slides, because I really want to talk about how are children in particularly affected by domestic violence, and what is the conversation around pets and domestic violence and homelessness. Some other forms that are not listed on this slide can be like a partner that is overly jealous, preventing their significant other from seeing their families, or preventing significant others from getting a job, going to school. This can look like economic or financial abuse, which again is sabotaging those employment opportunities, making sure that victims are not able to go to work because of visible injuries, jeopardizing a lot of these employment opportunities by stalking or harassing the victim at their workplace, and lastly, denying access to a vehicle or damaging the vehicle so that the victim cannot get to work. Again, these are just some of the ways that domestic violence can look in certain relationships. It's not to say that these are the only ways that domestic violence appears. There's certainly a number of ways that you can see this reflected in a domestic partnership. But this is just to kind of open up your mind to some of the ways that domestic violence can look like in a relationship. Oops. All right. So here, I really just wanted to share some statistics that put into perspective the effects of domestic violence. I don't generally share statistics because I do feel like it dehumanizes the experience of victims and survivors. But at the same time, I agree that it's important to kind of see or put these things into perspectives. So you'll see here that 38% of all domestic violence victims become homeless at some point in their lives. And I want to take this time to say that sometimes a victim will leave their abuser multiple times. It's not just like a one-all solution. Sometimes they will leave multiple times, which puts them through multiple forms of homelessness over the course of their relationship, or over the course of them just trying to find safety. And then the next statistic that I added on here is that between 22 and 57% of all homeless women report that domestic violence was the immediate cause of their homelessness. And again, we're going to dive into this topic a little bit more in one of the slides later on, where we'll really address what are some of those barriers that exist for domestic violence survivors to find stable housing. Another kind of a local statistic here is the amount of calls that the Chicago Police Department receives per day relating to domestic violence abuse. Now, I want to pose pop quiz. I want to pose this question to you all in the chat. If you had to guess, how many calls does the Chicago Police Department receive per day in relation to domestic violence abuse? What would you say that number is? I'll give you guys like a minute or two to think about that. So if you had to guess, about how many calls does CPD, the whole Chicago Police Department, receive per day in relation to domestic violence? All right, I see 28 in the chat. 434. 500. 150, 100, 250. So the person that said 28, I hope that one day we can get to that number. I hope one day we can get to 0 calls about domestic violence abuse. And Sarah from Wings Chicago, she hit it right on the nose in the chat, 434. So if you want to round that up into like 500 is the guesstimate number of calls that the Chicago Police Department receives on a daily basis relating to domestic violence abuse. And then, of course, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be right to have this conversation without acknowledging that for the past, during 2020, while we were all quarantined at home, many of the folks experiencing domestic violence abuse were quarantined with their abuser. So in 2020, for the week of March 16 to March 22, there were 2,882 domestic violence calls for service to the Chicago Police Department. And these are calls of folks trying to flee, trying to find safety, trying to get help and get support. So again, this is not to take away from the lives of domestic violence victims or survivors, but just to kind of put into perspective the public health crisis that is domestic violence. These statistics were provided by NNEDV, which is the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and we will drop these sources in the chat for you just to explore on your own if you want to check out their website for any further resources. Also in the chat is the Chicago Police Department Response to Domestic Violence brochure, where you can get a little bit more info on what law enforcement is doing locally to support some of these victims. All right, so we're going to jump into a quick myth or fact. And I have three statements here that I want to share with you all. And I would like for you to use the chat during this time and let me know if you think that this is a myth or is it a fact. So the statement is alcohol and drugs cause domestic violence. And I'll let you know it is kind of a trick question, but what do you think? Are alcohol and drugs the cause of domestic violence? Is this a myth or is it a fact? Fact, okay. Chanel says, no, I think it plays a part, but it's not the root issue. All right, we've got another one in the chat saying it's a fact. Okay, I'm going to do a light drum roll here. And the answer is that is actually a myth. The reality is that alcohol and drugs are not the actual cause of domestic violence. Domestic violence is a choice. Many abusers might use alcohol or drugs to blame their unjust actions, but the reality is that domestic abuse is a choice. Abusers may use the excuse that maybe they didn't have access to alcohol or drugs, and this could lead them to become angry and take it out on their partner or their family, their children, their pets. But the reality is that alcohol and drugs do not cause domestic violence. The next question I have for you all here, or the next statement I should say, is children are not aware of violence in their home. So what do you think? Do you think that children are not aware of violence in their home? Is this a myth or is it a fact? I see a myth. Myth. All right, it looks like the general consensus is that this is a myth. And kudos to you all, because this one is in fact a myth. The reality of the fact is that children are aware of the violence in their home because more than likely children will also fall victim to the abuse as well. They will also go on to experience different levels of stress and anxiety because of this constant need to be alert and expect danger in their home. Even when the family, let's say they are able to get away from their abuser, they are able to find refuge in a shelter, or maybe they're able to find stable housing. The reality is that the children will still experience some type of long-term behavioral issues as they're learning to cope and heal. And I want to focus on this one a little bit just because the work that our organization does in partnering with youth and family shelters throughout the city, we recognize that we are serving youth who have experienced tremendous amount of trauma before coming to the shelter environment. So for us, it is a matter of not only recognizing this, but working to understand the population that we serve a little bit more, and understanding that anytime that we're in program, their behavior is a language. Their behavior is expressing to us maybe some type of discomfort, some type of anxiety, some type of stress that they might be feeling while they're there. So it's up to us. It's our responsibility to become informed on all of the ways that we can support this child, support their social emotional regulation in our program space, and be able to manage these different behavioral reactions that might come up for us every day while we are in program. All right. And my last myth or fact for you all is the victim can just leave. The victim can just leave. What do you think? Do you think the victim can just leave? Is this a myth or a fact? No. Myth. Myth. Yeah. It is. Yeah. This is indeed a myth. And I want to just bring our attention to the graphic that's on the screen, because this, for me, visually captures what it can be like to be in this situation, where you might feel like you're trapped, you might feel alone, you might feel like no one is there to listen to you. And, you know, first and foremost, it's not our place to suggest what the victim should do or say. It's not okay to tell someone, okay, well, you can just leave, or, you know, just let that person go. Because the reality is, for some of the reasons that we mentioned earlier, that whether it's their finances, their freedom, or their family members have all been cut off from them by their abuser. And then the other huge factor here is housing. If a victim leaves, they risk becoming homeless. They risk exposing their families to multiple layers of trauma that come with homelessness. Although there are several battered women shelters throughout the city, some of them also do not accept small pets, and some of them are reserved only for women and children. So if a family has an older male child, like say 17, 18, it's more than likely that that child will not be able to stay there with the family. I want to bring it into that part about pets, right? Because for many of us, or for many families experiencing domestic violence, their pets can be a source of emotional support as they battle these difficult times. And I want to bring your attention to the blog that's in the chat. Is actually from one of our AmeriCorps members, Sarah. She wrote this to bring awareness to the topic of the link between animal abuse, domestic violence, and homelessness. And in there, she shares that there are less than 5 pet-friendly shelters in each state. In the whole entire state, there are less than 5 pet-friendly shelters. So, you know, just to kind of, again, bring that into perspective, because when we say, okay, you can just leave, it's not as easy as it may sound, right? There's multiple barriers that's stopping this person from just leaving, from just walking out, whether that's safety, that's sometimes leaving behind their kids, leaving with their kids, finding housing, their pets, financial stability. So sometimes weighing that risk, right? Weighing out, like, do I leave or do I stay? It can be a difficult decision to make. So, you know, just to kind of bring that back and shift that perspective a little bit on when people say, okay, well, you can just leave, because this is indeed a myth. No one can just easily pick up and leave. All right. So thank you for participating in the myth or fact. I hope that was helpful to just kind of bring some things into perspective and, you know, try to debunk some of those myths that many of us might hear when we're talking about domestic violence, when we're talking about the relationship between domestic violence and homelessness. And that brings me to this last slide. What are some of those contributing factors of homelessness? How is it that domestic violence victims or survivors find themselves in this continuous cycle of homelessness? So we have already talked about, what is domestic violence? What does it look like? And what are some of the ways that abusers gain control and continue to perpetuate fear over their victims? And I hope that, by outlining this, we're able to make the connections on how that behavior correlates with homelessness and why victims are caught up in these continuous cycles. So as we referenced earlier, economic stability is a huge factor. So if an abuser is sabotaging a victim's economic stability, that can look like they have total control over the bills. The victim doesn't have any control over the bills, any control over the money at home. This can make it hard for them if they are trying to leave and they are trying to find an apartment where they need to provide proof of income, proof of rental history or anything like that. So that can be a huge barrier in just leaving, but also once they do leave, how can they sustain themselves through stable housing? And then also in the mix of that is just having a good credit score, having good financial history in general, so that they're able to then, sustain themselves, sustain their family, find stable housing. It's a lot to take on, for sure. And then the next piece here is the shelter stay. So the next factor, with shelter stay is that shelters are not meant to be a permanent solution to homelessness. They're meant to be a temporary solution to homelessness. There was a point in time where shelters were not equipped to accept victims of domestic violence. And I see Sarah, thanks for dropping that in the chat. This was a study that I came upon in my research for this presentation, that in the early 1970s, that's when the battered women's movement started happening. So I highly encourage you, if you want to, just kind of dive deeper into that conversation, like how did shelters become domestic violence shelters? What did it take for us as a society in order to move in that direction? I highly encourage you to check that out. But the reality is that A, shelters are not a permanent solution to housing, but B, if let's say a victim is trying to leave their situation and there are no domestic violence shelters with any beds that are available, then they're forced to go to a local shelter in their community or a local shelter in their city. And quite frankly, some of these shelters may not be as equipped to handle domestic violence victims and their situation, whether that's ensuring their safety, making sure that, they feel safe, that abusers can't find them, they can't get to them, and just being able to provide some of those supportive services. Which brings me to my next step. Another factor that contributes to homelessness is having access to some of these services. So not only having access to stable housing and finding stable housing, but making sure that they have the legal support in order to combat safety, because with domestic violence, victims are constantly having to go to court, face their abusers, retell their story, relive their trauma. So having that legal support available, having mental health and healing care available for them, and being able to extend some of those services to their children. So you can see that there is a difference between having, a local shelter that is there to kind of combat just the housing need, but then when you add domestic violence survivors to that conversation, they need a little bit more support. They need a little bit more rehabilitation in order to come back into society and function as contributing members. So I hope that, this was able to just kind of put into perspective for you all, what is domestic violence? What are some of the ways that, we think about domestic violence? And then just in general, how does domestic violence continue to perpetuate the cycle of homelessness for many youth and families in our city? So before I jump over to Sarah from Wings Chicago, I do want to just share with you all ways that you can stay connected with our organization. We are on all social media channels as Shy Hopes for Kids. We have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all of that good stuff. Um, on the left here, you'll see some pictures of our program, and this is kind of what our general read aloud time looks like with our students. So if you're interested in volunteering, that's a good way to stay involved, to get connected. We also have folks that donate snacks to our program, which is a huge part of just addressing the need for access to fresh food for a lot of our students. We've had folks fundraise for supplies. If you're not able to do any of those, you can still share our posts on social media, share the work that we do, and just bring general awareness to homelessness and to domestic violence as a whole. So I'm going to stop sharing. All right. Okay, here we go. All right. Hi, Sarah. I will pass it over to you if you just want to introduce yourself and share a little bit about Wings, and then we'll kind of jump into the conversation.
Yeah, well, yeah, my name is Sarah Swiston. I'm the Foundation and Corporate Grants Manager at Wings. I've been with the agency for over 3 years, and then before that, I actually worked in DuPage Pads and for a homeless agency doing communications and marketing. So the space, like ties very well with both of like what's been my professional passion for many years. And so yeah, I just believe everyone should have a safe place to call home, and because that's really the foundation of what we need to thrive. So that's an overview, I guess, of me. If you want me to talk about Wings, Wings was founded in 1985, and it actually started because there was a spike in homelessness in the area. Particularly, it started in the northwest suburbs where Wings started, and they found that the primary cause for homelessness for women was domestic violence. So it started with a lot of transitional housing, and then since then we've grown and expanded. So when we first started, it was just in the northwest suburbs of Cook County, but in 2005, we realized people needed emergency shelter, and so we opened a safe house in the northwest suburbs. And then in 2016, we opened Wings Metro, which is in the Chicago Lawn neighborhood in Chicago. So yeah, we just recognized 6 years of service there, and all the time we keep continuing to diversify the type of housing we can offer clients. Just recently we've been able to get some rapid rehousing funding, which is also critical, as as you were mentioning, with the influx of calls and contacts due to the pandemic. The shelters have been full. I think in maybe that same network report you are using, they talk about how there was like that's one of the major things that people were calling for. And did I even put that in my notes? But yeah, but no, it's definitely a huge need. And yeah, and then we've also we've had mentoring programs for many years, but last year we also started a Survivor Lifeline mentoring program where someone that has been a survivor themselves is mentoring someone that's moving from a DV shelter into housing. And so they can kind of form this partnership. They receive encouragement and support and advice from someone who's been in their shoes. So that's something that we wanted to start for a while that we got to kick off. So we have a lot of services in the area to kind of, similar to your agency, like holistically support the person in whatever they need. So that's, I think, Wings in a nutshell. I guess the last thing I would say is that this past fall, we recognized the milestone of providing 1 million nights of shelter and safe housing. And so, while it's it's like quite a benchmark, and an accomplishment in a way, it's also, kind of sad and humbling to think that behind that number, there's all these stories of people that are just trying to make a better life and that need the support. So, but yeah.
Thank you for that. I mean, it sounds like you guys are feet on the ground, doing the work, and making an impact, especially throughout the city in Chicago. Are you able to just share a little bit more about what are some of the biggest challenges that your organization have seen that domestic violence victims are facing?
Yeah. Well, for sure you talked about a lot of the the ways that abusers will try to um, control their partners, and really that's what the abuse is about. It's about power control, and so because they use these different tools, financial abuse is probably one of the hardest things that we see that our survivors face. That's like a huge hurdle to surpass for them, because nearly all of domestic violence situations have involved some level of financial or economic abuse. And then kind of as you also brought up, emotional abuse, they've name calling, crazy making, gaslighting, humiliating, mind games, guilt trips. And then after all of that, minimizing and, denying or, making light of it or saying they caused it, manipulation, intimidation, all of those things, threatening, especially with the pets, threatening to commit suicide, threatening to call DCFS on them or immigration, all these different ways. Isolation, you kind of talked about that too. Um, controlling where they go, and children also. It's one of the hardest barriers for leaving. They don't want their children to face homelessness. And even if they have some kind of joint custody situation with the courts, the abuser can use that opportunity to harass the survivor, threaten to take the children away. If they have been suffering from financial abuse, which they likely have been, it's often the abuser that is the breadwinner that looks to be in the court, the more stable parent. So it's all very real and challenging for that. So, housing, housing, the cost of housing, the lack of affordable housing. Sometimes, the abuser will, take out credit cards or ruin credit in the survivor's name. So they might have past evictions, and that can all make housing challenging. If they weren't allowed to, all the things that go along with financial abuse, not able to work, sometimes not able to get career skills, not able to manage the money, credit ruined, low wage unemployment, lack of reliable childcare, lack of transportation, and then emotional abuse. We've seen higher levels of trauma of people coming to our agency since the pandemic. So, often in the cycle of violence, there'll be a honeymoon period, after an event. And we're seeing like reduced honeymoon periods, it's just relentless. It's been more relentless since the pandemic. And in our last fiscal year, 72% of our counseling cases had at least one behavioral health concern. So mental illness, suicidal ideation, substance abuse. And that's just, the substance abuse is often just a way to cope. So, when they are isolated, they've lost their family support. They've, the family's either fed up they haven't left sooner, or they're fed up that they're giving up on their relationship because it's not, maybe what their culture is about or their faith is about. So, and then lack of access to legal and medical services. So those all combine, like the image of the woman in the cage, to create some kind of, it seems like insurmountable to some people to want to leave. So that's kind of the challenges that we're seeing.
Oh, it's hard to talk about these things in general, right? It's hard to talk about these things in general. Like, I feel the tone in my voice changing because it's heavy, it's a heavy topic to think about, as a mother, as a partner, all of these things. We try to just like contextualize it and try to make the connection to it. So just thank you for expanding on that, because it's something that, it happens to many, many of us. And a lot of times we may not even know that it's happening. So I'm curious to hear from you more about what are some of the resources that your organization offers for domestic violence victims, maybe even like once they've found stable housing? Like, what are some of those wraparound services and what does that look like?
Oh, for sure, for sure. And yeah, so we don't have, we don't discriminate like age, gender, race, ethnicity, all of that. So like if there was an older child, male, they would still be able to come to our safe houses, and that kind of thing. And even, LGBTQA, like they're, welcoming spaces for them. I think what the supportive service, just some of them positive relationship building, connecting them, making sure they're connected to the mainstream resources, budgeting assistance if they've never had that before, financial empowerment courses. We have partners that help with that, employment counseling, um, food, and why, and why, food, you're like, oh, that's not really a support service, but we, in our safe houses specifically, we have kitchen coordinators that are they bring a diversity lens, equity lens to the meals. They'll buy authentic spices, depending on the background. If they ask the vegetarians, do they like the meat alternative? Do they not really like their things? They figure out what the favorite meals are and then serve it to them on their birthday or when they're exiting the program. So those are just kind of, like specific examples. Clothing, we have, sometimes people just leave with the clothes on their back, and so, or very little they can, they've been able to take. So we have 3 resale stores, and we have one in the city as well, that survivors can go and shop there. We give them gift cards. And so we also collect donations, from them. And so, from like the community members. And so like we have, so survivors can go there and shop and pick out, their own clothing, what fits their needs, feel like they're shopping, and then they just have a gift card. Um, Case management so that they can focus on certain goals, advocacy, within housing programs, transportation, we can help with childcare things. Education is key, safety planning, especially, especially if the children, often they have to continue to work with their abuser. And we have a comprehensive children's and family service program where we have children advocates that stay with children and, throughout their time in our programs. And, that's one of the goals of the program is, can you identify 2 things that you can do to feel safe? And, also, do you recognize that the abuse that happened is not your fault? So definitely we have child therapists and things that help, throughout our residential programs. And we're hoping to expand that open to the community, if we can continue to grow. And, and then the mentoring kind of that I touched on before, but yeah, so that's, you know,
Yeah, I did not know about the resale shop. That is pretty cool. I'm gonna have to
yeah,
look into that because well, after donation items sit in my car for a week or two, then I drop them off. But that is so cool to know that you guys accept, gently used items and things like that, which kind of brings me to my next question. What can we do as a wider community to support the work that you guys are doing? And I want to ask this because even though maybe we are not, directly connected to someone that might be experiencing domestic violence, but that doesn't mean that we can't help, that we can't support, that we can't raise awareness. What are some of the ways that your organization allows for the wider community to support the work that you do?
yeah, definitely. Well, always, like all nonprofits, we need donations to keep functioning. So that's something. And then we also have, a list of most needed items on our website, and that gets updated all the time. So sometimes it's diapers of a certain size, sometimes it's underwear, and sometimes it's seasonal, and around the holidays we'll have special things like wish lists and things. Um, so yeah, and then also, like the resale stores donating to those if you can. And then people that are interested in volunteering, it's been kind of weird with the pandemic, but we are starting to open that up again. We have, if people want to work with clients, we do have, there is a mandated 40-hour training. Um, to prepare people to work with clients. And so, we have people that work at our safe houses or people that want to work with the kids while the parents are doing a group or something. So that is something that we have. And then, but we also have one-time opportunities like sorting donations at like one of our one of our logistic centers and things. And then also just like learning more, you can follow us on social media, learn, get to see, kind of what we're doing, but it's just some examples.
Yes, thank you. Thank you also, Sarah from Hopes, for dropping those links in the chat. Those will take you directly to the Wings website for more information on just domestic violence abuse and what are some of the ways that you can help. I know our staff at Hopes are all trained. They all go through the 40-hour certification. We do it through the Connections for Abused Women and Children. So it's like a 2-week training that our staff takes before they go into the shelter environment. So I know on our end, that's something that we're doing, to just be prepared to work with this population of people, and also just general events like this where we highlight the work that we do. We raise awareness to some of these factors that contribute to homelessness, and of course just amplify the work of other organizations like Wings and the CAWC that are out there doing the work every day, right? You guys are the ones at the forefront and making an impact every single day. So I just want to say thank you again, Sarah, for coming on this call today. Thank you for imparting your knowledge, sharing more about your organization. And just again, another thank you to everybody that was here today. It means a lot that you took this hour out of your day to just educate yourself a little bit more on domestic violence. And I hope that this workshop was able to provide for you general information on domestic violence, what you can do, how you can stay more aware. I encourage you to look through some of the resources that we dropped in the chat. I will also be sharing these in an email once we get off our meeting today. I will share a recording of this training that's going to go up on our YouTube page. And I'll also share the links that we dropped in the chat so that you can continue to pass this information forward, continue to spread the word, and raise awareness. So I guess, go ahead.
One more thing. Just like, it's been kind of a heavy, sad conversation at parts, but I just wanted to say that sometimes people do go back to the abusers, or sometimes we don't know what happens to people, but we did actually have a child who was in one of our programs come back to us as an intern to work with the children because of her experience. And now she wants to be a social worker. She's getting her master's. And so you can just kind of see, how that ripple is going to continue to help break the cycle of violence. And so we do hear those stories. And so it's not all sad stories.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. So it's important to make space for the joy and the beauty that does come out of these situations. As it happens with any other traumatic experience, there is always beauty in the struggle. And it's thank you for making space to share that, because it is important to know that, some of them make it. Some of them are real, true survivors. And it's beautiful to see that, their story empowered them to now pay it forward and be that source of light for someone else. So thank you for that. All right, you all. If anybody doesn't have any questions at this point, I again just want to say thank you for taking the time today. You'll be receiving an email from me with kind of a recap.
Deb, I think your audio might have gone out for a second, just at the last part after uploading the YouTube video.
Oh, did I cut off in the middle there?
Yeah, just the tail end if you want to repeat that part.
I'm sorry. Just a general thank you for your time today, and I'm going to send an email with all of the resources shortly. All right, I will let you guys go. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.